the first one, I'm kind of cheating, rolling three into one, but they're kind of like the basics of well-being. They're the kind of fundamentals, which is good nutrition, prioritizing sleep, and also physical activity. And the reason I mention them is there's a positive psychologist called Professor Laurie Santos at Yale University. She runs the most popular course in the university's history, and it's about happiness. It's called the Psychology and the Good Life. And she says we, as a species, we underestimate how important good eating, good sleep, and regular physical activity is for our well-being. And you can do all this other stuff that has a good kind of scientific basis for improving our well-being, mindfulness, etc., other things, gratitude. But if you haven't got those basics right, then it's not going to have the impact. The other things won't have the impact you want them to. So just very basically, just making sure that you are feeding yourself well. And part of that means making sure that you give yourself, when you're at school, time to eat a lunch and have prepared or bought something fairly nutritious. Don't just reach for junk food, even though that's, when you're tired and stressed, that's what you crave. Sleep, as someone that had to let go of a lot of the things I can control around sleep, because a lot of it, i.e. my son, is out of my control. I can kind of set him routines and et cetera. But if he wakes up crying in the middle of the night, then that disrupts my sleep and my wife's sleep. However, there are things that I can control, which is, turning my phone off, not being on a device at least an hour before I go to bed, leaving my device, charging it in the kitchen downstairs rather than having it on my bedside table, making sure we've got blackout blinds. It really helps to have dark room at night. Have some air coming in. It helps to have a cool room. There's lots of little hacks you can do to improve the quality of your sleep. And the last thing, regular physical activity. You don't have to sign up for marathons or triathlons or anything like that. It's literally trying to walk at least 30 minutes a day. And again, something that I do at school is at lunchtime, I get out of the school grounds every single time I'm in school, go for a walk around the block, go to a shop to go and get my, a nice sandwich. But that means every day I'm getting at least 20 minutes just in my school day, walk somewhere, walk back. So those are the basics: eat, sleep, and exercise. The other thing I'd say is mindfulness, in brackets, kind of just trying to focus on the present moment more. Essentially, when we're in a time of crisis or high stress, our mind starts to kind of ruminate, either dwells on the negative because we have this negativity bias, which is an evolutionary hangover. It's a survival mechanism, but when we're stressed, we typically just focus on the threats in our lives rather than all the things that are going well. But mindfulness, either formally practiced or just tuning into what's happening here and now, is a way of just bringing your mind back to focusing on the reality of the situation rather than getting caught up in the what ifs, because they typically do stress us out. In fact, there was a study done at Harvard University, and the conclusion was, what they found with the participants was that about almost half of our lives is spent in a state of mind wandering, so not focused on the present moment. And what they found is that when we're in a state of mind wandering, we're less satisfied with our lives compared to when we're focused on the present moment, even if the present moment is boring, dull, and in some instances unpleasant. And so what they concluded was that a human mind is a wandering mind, and a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. So whatever you can do, whether it is formal meditation practice or just, reminding yourself to focus on what's right in front of you, try and tune into what's happening right here, right now, and just focus on the facts and the reality of the situation. And the last thing is, I'd say, perspective. Like, our perspective is so fundamental to how we feel. And in fact, there's a well-known saying in positive psychology and happiness generally, which is, your happiness depends on what you pay attention to. So it's really important that we and this comes back to mindfulness, because mindfulness is about your attention and having greater control over your attention. But, you know, what are you paying attention to? Make sure you're focusing on the things that really matter right now. So gratitude is really important. That influences our perspective. So even in a global pandemic, there are things that we can be grateful for. So I'm grateful that my family are well and healthy. I'm grateful that my son is settled well into his reception class. I'm grateful that his school are prioritizing the things that matter, which is children's safety and their sense of belonging. So, you know, be grateful. Focus on what's actually going well. So there's lots of research around an activity called 3 Good Things, or What Went Well, which is essentially really simple. Treat yourself to a nice little jotter journal, put it on your bedside table, and before you go to bed, write down 3 things that have gone well for you that day. And they can be the smallest things, like you enjoyed your first cup of tea or coffee in the morning, you had a nice chat with a neighbor, you know, over your garden fence, whatever it is. Just write them down and savor them, because what happens is over time you start to notice more small good things that are happening all around you that we normally don't pay attention to. And the last thing is linked to perspective, and this is something I've written about in my new book, which is called A Little Guide to Teacher Wellbeing and Self-Care, which I've co-authored with Dr. Emma Kell. It's a teacher in the UK. There's a section on mortality, essentially. That there was a brilliant book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying, written by a palliative care nurse called Bonnie Ware, who had the privileged position of spending time with patients in the last literally days, couple of weeks of their lives. And they often opened up to her and shared things that they were proud of, but also their regrets. You know, if they had their time over again, what would they do differently? And the top 5 regrets, and I'll just share them now because I think these really help us just tune into what really matters. 1, they often regretted working so hard. They wish they'd worked less. 2, they wish they'd seen their friends more, prioritized seeing and hanging out with friends. 3, they wish they'd been true to themselves and followed a life and values that were important to them, rather than, you know, maybe following a life that was important to their parents or outside forces. 4, they wish they'd expressed themselves more openly. So often they reported suppressing their own feelings to make other people happy, and that made them less happy in the process. And 5, and this is important to me and links to the whole book, they wish they'd let themselves be happier. And I found that really interesting, that they reflected that happiness was a choice, and that they had the choice, you know, over a lot of their lives, and they wish they'd chosen to be happier, followed the things that they were important to them, but also that brought them joy and pleasure. And I think that, you know, being in a global pandemic is actually, in some regards, a really fortuitous thing, because it stops us in our tracks, breaks us out of our habitual ways of thinking and behaving, and literally is a life and death situation. It really brings to the fore what matters to us, what is important, what can we let go of that isn't serving us anymore. And this is all important for perspective. It's about how we see the world, and then how we choose to spend our time based on what matters to us. So those are my 3 top tips. Eat, sleep, and exercise, number 1. Number 2 is focus, bring your attention to the present moment, what's happening right here, right now. And then perspective, be grateful, focus on the positives, and, you know, tune into what really matters, and let that guide your actions and your behaviors.